All right, story time. So I don't usually like to swear in professional settings, so I hope you forgive me my censored swear word here, but this is something that I feel so frustrated about, not just for myself, but for all of us, because this has been a problem for so long that I feel professional organizations have really failed to address in a timely manner. And now, whenever we experience economic crisis, and especially now, because we are in the middle of one and a pandemic, this makes it all the more harder for us as employees in traditional employment in organizations that already aren't usually wealthy and are already not doing a good job of making sure that we're being compensated appropriately. So, for many reasons, I find this very frustrating and ultimately disrespectful of the work that we do and the people that we are. And so I'm going to share my story with you because I have found that unfortunately it is very common to what many of you have experienced. And hopefully, by me sharing what I have gone through, you will find lessons and maybe can short circuit some of the lessons that I learned. So, with that said, I spent the first 10-ish years of my career traditionally employed, first at a large institution that was half federal, half nonprofit, in a term position, which I then got to be a permanent position. And then at my next place of traditional employment, it was at what is now a university, and it was in a part-time position, which I then got turned into full-time and partially endowed. And so my experiences have, unfortunately, run the gamut of being a term position and also being a part-time position, both in institutions that on paper or in theory should be doing well financially, and yet as archivist, historian, etc., museum professional in those different settings, I found that I still had to advocate for my worth, which it just blows my mind as a side note in terms of like the work that we do. Because we're doing it, we of course view it as so critical, but in reality it is very critical that we're taking care of these collections and making them available. So it just blows my mind as a side note that because the institutions view those collections as important, that doesn't translate all the time to therefore the collection workers are also important. Anyway, back to my story. So for me in those positions, and especially in the last position that I held before I left the field for a little bit and then became a consultant, is the position they brought me in for. After a year of being there, it was quite clear that the position description was no longer accurate. And part of that was because they never had an archivist before, and the people who were in charge of creating the archives didn't have an archivist background, had never worked at institutions where they had an archives, just did not have that information available. And while I definitely give credit to my former boss for doing the best they could in terms of seeking out that information, it still fell far short of what it needed to be. And so after a year, I started documenting and advocating for the position description to be updated, for the compensation to be adjusted appropriately, and started tracking all of the responsibilities and daily requirements that I was doing that was required and asked of me for the archives to thrive and be created, but was not on my position description and was therefore not something that I was being compensated appropriately for. And so, starting advocacy after year one, I ended up working there for about 5 years, and this was a battle the whole time, unfortunately. Part of it was the institution wasn't doing well financially, so HR basically stopped reviewing position descriptions. They refused to update my position description for at least a year, putting it off. And then they finally did agree to revise my position and took another year to revise it, even though I did all of the work for them. I then also gathered all the classifications they had created for the institution, of which, of course, archivist wasn't included. The closest they got was library services coordinator and manager, except I was doing not library services. I was managing a whole department about archives and doing a significant amount of grant writing and fundraising and bringing money into the institution and the archives. So I gathered those. I gathered related positions and salaries from around the area, including federal schedules. I was then asked to call my peers in the area and ask how much they were making, which for them to ask me to do that seems wildly inappropriate. Fortunately, I had and have good relationships with those people in my area, but we're far spread out. We're working at different institutions. There are different budgets at play. We're doing awesome stuff, but not exactly the same stuff or roles. And what I ended up finding out was that this was a tactic to suppress all of our salaries. We were all making within a couple thousand of each other, and each of us had been told that we were making the average salary for an archivist in this position and that therefore it was market rate. But as you can see, the problem with this is that because everybody is using that excuse, none of us were getting the compensation we deserved. And it had been that way for 10 years and continues, unfortunately, to be the case. So when HR asks you to do that, just know that that is what tactic is being deployed, and it is not accurate. It is inappropriate, and I don't think ethical, but there you go. So after 5 years, after all of that, after fighting for my worth and constantly telling everybody of the successes we were having and educating higher ups, my boss, HR included, of what all of this entailed, they did finally agree to change the position description. And they did finally agree that that position should make, I think it was $6,000 more, which was considerable given the pay I was having at the time. But because it took 5 years for them to address that, and because the entire process was so disrespectful and toxic, and I was not treated very nicely by HR, when they finally gave me that news, and you would think I would have felt great for them to finally acknowledge that, yes, I should have been paid $6,000 more a year for 5 years, I quit. That was it. I could not handle not being respected and not being paid my worth, and for them to have knowingly done that for so many years. So I quit, and took a break from this field, which I know many of you unfortunately are at that precipice. So that is my story about a girl who just wanted to be paid her fucking worth. And I will say that is why I eventually got into consulting. And while I had never had dreams of being a business owner or entrepreneur, I do have to say, from a mental health perspective, of being the one to say yes or no to things, and for being the one who gets to determine my worth and be paid my worth, is so amazing. And so while there are many difficulties and hurdles to starting your own business, and it has not been easy by any stretch, I have to say this was the best thing to ever happen to me. So hopefully that story helps.